December 17, 1944, near Malmedy, Belgium. Snow drifts down in silence. The forest is still, except for the low growl of engines crawling along a frozen road. A column of American jeeps inches through the fog. Men bundled in heavy coats, rifles slung over their shoulders, exhaustion etched across their faces. The Battle of the Bulge has begun, but few of them know it yet. At a crossroads, a pair of military police step forward, their breath visible in the cold. "Halt!" one shouts. Headlights catch the stenciled white stars on the jeeps. Everything looks right. Uniforms, helmets, weapons. The MP leans closer. "Where are you fellas headed?" "Bastogne," comes the reply. The accent is perfect. The papers look fine. Then, almost casually, the MP asks, "Who won the World Series this year?" A pause, the driver hesitates. His eyes dart briefly to the man beside him. The silence stretches just a moment too long. The MP's hand tightens on his Thompson. Out of the vehicle now. Within minutes, the illusion collapses. They are not Americans. They are Germans, disguised, fluent, and deadly, sent behind enemy lines to tear apart the Allied war machine from within. And this was only the beginning. By late 1944, the war in Europe seemed all but lost for Germany. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable across the continent, was now being driven back toward its own borders. The Allied landings in Normandy had shattered German defenses in the west. Paris had fallen in August. The Soviets were hammering from the east, closing in on the Reich with overwhelming numbers and firepower. Yet, in Adolf Hitler's mind, the war was not over. In his mountain headquarters at Berchtesgaden, and later deep inside the Reich Chancellery, he planned one final counterstroke, a blow so audacious it might split the Allied front and force the Western powers to negotiate. He called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. The objective was breathtaking in scale. German forces would strike through the Ardennes, a region of rolling hills and dense forest spanning Belgium and Luxembourg, where the Allies least expected a major attack. The terrain had been used before, in 1940, when German panzers had swept through in a lightning strike that brought France to its knees. Hitler hoped history might repeat itself. The plan called for three powerful German armies: the 6th Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, to smash through thinly held American lines. Their goal: cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and cut the Allied armies in half. If successful, the offensive could encircle entire divisions, disrupt logistics, and perhaps even convince the Western Allies to seek peace, allowing Germany to focus all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. But reality made the plan nearly impossible. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, its manpower depleted and fuel stocks critically low. Luftwaffe air cover was minimal, and American air superiority was overwhelming whenever the weather cleared. The only thing working in Hitler's favor was the weather itself: thick winter fog and heavy snow that grounded Allied aircraft in muffled sound. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes shattered. More than 2,000 German guns opened fire, pounding the American front. Panzer divisions and Volksgrenadier units surged forward through the mist. Overwhelming thin American defenses manned mostly by inexperienced or resting divisions. Within hours, communication lines were severed, supply convoys lost, and roads clogged with retreating vehicles. The Americans, caught completely off guard, struggled to understand what was happening. The fog, the unfamiliar terrain, and the sudden movement of enemy armor made it difficult to tell who was who. That confusion would soon become the Germans' greatest weapon. As Hitler's armies advanced, another, smaller operation unfolded behind the front lines, a secret project designed not to fight directly, but to sow chaos within the Allied rear. It involved deception, disguise, and flawless impersonation. The concept had come from one of Hitler's most daring and unconventional officers, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, already famous for rescuing Benito Mussolini from captivity in 1943. Skorzeny had earned Hitler's personal trust, becoming the Führer's favorite commando. His missions blended audacity with deception, always striking psychological blows as much as physical ones. Now Hitler tasked him with an operation that would exploit the confusion of the Ardennes offensive. to infiltrate Allied lines dressed as American soldiers, capture key bridges, redirect traffic, and spread false orders. The plan was codenamed Operation Greif, the Griffin. Its premise was simple but dangerous. Skorzeny's men would disguise themselves in captured American uniforms, drive captured Allied vehicles, and move freely through enemy territory. Their job was not large-scale sabotage but disruption, switching signposts, misdirecting convoys, cutting phone lines, and causing enough disorder that Allied command would lose control of the battlefield. For the plan to work, secrecy was paramount, and execution would require perfect mimicry. Skorzeny knew this would be unlike any commando raid he had attempted. His men would have to think, speak, and behave like Americans. One wrong phrase, one accent misplaced, and they would be exposed, and likely executed as spies under the laws of war. In the chaos of the Ardennes, where no one could be certain who was approaching from the fog, the line between friend and foe was already blurred. Operation Greif would erase it entirely, and as the panzers roared westward, those disguised infiltrators began slipping into the white haze, setting the stage for one of the strangest episodes of World War II, where the battlefield would no longer be defined by uniforms or flags, but by identity itself. Would you like me to continue to Section 2 of the context background next, 800 words, where I'll cover the creation and training of Operation Greif, the methods of disguise, and how the first infiltrations unfolded? Skorzeny moved quickly. He gathered men who spoke English, who had lived abroad, who could mimic American speech and manner. Some were ethnic Germans from the United States or Britain. Others had served in units with Allied prisoners and had learned phrases. Roughly 100 to 200 volunteers took the risk. They trained in secrecy at Paderborn and other locations inside the Reich. Training was practical and relentless. Men learned to strip and wear captured uniforms without leaving telltale seams. They practiced American drill plates and salutations. They studied insignia, divisional patches, service stripes, collar discs, until the differences blurred. They practiced vehicle markings, how a white star sat on a hood, how sandbags looked under a windshield, how an M3 half-track carried stowage. Mechanics taught them how to run Allied radios and how to make an American Jeep sound right. Linguists drilled idioms, troop slang, and baseball references. Map exercises forced them to navigate American-style road signs and unit codes. The goal was not to act like paratroopers or panzer crews, but to pass casual inspection at a checkpoint and exploit the assumptions of soldiers exhausted by winter war. Logistics were part of the deception. Skorzeny's men used captured Allied vehicles, jeeps, trucks, even a few tanks and armored cars, taken from battlefields or from supply dumps. They repaired these vehicles and repainted or preserved markings. They collected ration tins, maps, and American periodicals to make their billets look authentic. Papers were forged. Briefing folders were prepared to mirror Allied staff packs. Every item that could reduce suspicion was smuggled into the operation. Intelligence played a role. Skorzeny's planners studied Allied radio procedures and patrol schedules. They identified key choke points, bridges, crossroads, supply hubs, and command posts. The intention was surgical disruption. They were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to mislead. A false order could send a convoy the wrong way. A missing sign could strand a column on a muddy lane. A scrambled radio transmission might delay a counterattack. Small errors multiplied in the fog of winter. In the first hours of the Ardennes offensive, a number of these disguised units slipped forward with the main assault. Eyewitness reports later described jeeps with white stars that stopped American columns and issued orders in fluent English. Some convoys were halted at fake checkpoints. Road signs were altered overnight. Arrows redirected. Telephone lines were cut at places where repair crews expected to find German saboteurs. Command messages were sometimes intercepted or delayed by the confusion the infiltrators created. The effect was not uniform. Many attempts failed. Men with poor accents or incorrect slang were immediately suspected. Some infiltrators were captured within hours. Nevertheless, enough penetrated to seed doubt. American soldiers began to question the identity of those who hailed them. Headquarters received fragmentary reports of strange behavior. Soldiers carrying the wrong issue of rations, MPs finding identification with misspellings, drivers using British English terms. Skorzeny himself moved to the lines. He coordinated through liaison channels and monitored results. He sought to use deception where it could do the most damage, at junctions that fed toward Antwerp, at bridges that if held could slow down Allied response, and in headquarters where a false verbal order might be plausible. The Germans also considered more dramatic options, attempts to capture or kill specific Allied commanders, but those plans were risky and, in most cases, unrealized. The Americans reacted in ways that would define the episode. Initial disbelief gave way to tightened security. Military police units, still recovering from surprise and stretched thin, were ordered to check identities rigorously. Roadblocks proliferated. Patrol patterns changed. Rumors ran through units like wildfire. Saboteurs in American uniforms, spies at midnight, English-speaking Germans in the rear. The rumor mill did something worse than fact. It multiplied suspicion. One anecdote, later retold in after-action accounts and unit histories, became emblematic of the solution the Americans developed. Cultural questions. Military police and interrogators began to ask simple, rapid-fire questions that were easy for an American soldier and hard for an imposter to answer on the spot. Questions about local sports, state capitals, slang that betrayed regional birth, or recent baseball results. The baseball question became famous not because it was systematically documented in every report, but because it captured the idea. Identity, in wartime, can hide in a casual cultural detail. Operationally, Operation Greif never produced the decisive, strategic blow Hitler had hoped for. It did not capture Antwerp or split the Allied armies. But it did what Skorzeny intended in part. It frayed trust, slowed movement, and forced Allied commanders to divert resources to rear area security. For a few days in December 1944, uncertainty itself became a weapon. Those ripples, human fear, command responses, moral questions, tactical shifts, would be felt at every level of the front. They opened new fault lines in a battle already brutal and chaotic, and they set the stage for the deeper examinations that followed. The human angle. Fear behind friendly lines by. The third day of the Ardennes offensive, the most dangerous enemy in the American rear, was not a tank column. It was doubt. Rumors spread faster than any German jeep. Soldiers began to question everything. The man beside them, the officer giving orders, the MPs checking passes. Roadblocks multiplied along every major route in Belgium. Each one meant another nervous encounter between men who, only days earlier, would have passed each other with a simple salute. Now, every handshake was a test. Every voice was suspect. Accounts from soldiers in the 101st, 82nd, and 3rd Armored Divisions describe an atmosphere of eerie mistrust. MPs stopped columns at gunpoint, demanding identification, asking questions about baseball scores, movie stars, or state capitals. Some men were detained for hours simply because of a regional accent or a moment's hesitation. At one checkpoint, a colonel was arrested because he answered that the capital of Illinois was Chicago, a common mistake under pressure. At another, a jeep carrying a legitimate courier was riddled with bullets after ignoring a challenge in the dark. In a war already defined by chaos, this new layer of fear, the fear of mistaken identity, deepened the sense that no one was safe. The infiltrators had struck only briefly, but their psychological impact outlasted their presence. Soldiers began to see ghosts in familiar uniforms. To an exhausted private in the snow, every jeep engine approaching through the fog might carry Germans pretending to be friends. The leadership angle. Eisenhower under siege. When word reached Allied headquarters that German commandos were operating in U.S. uniforms, it hit the top echelons like a shockwave. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, suddenly found himself at the center of an invisible threat. Reports filtered in that Skorzeny's men might be aiming to capture or assassinate senior commanders, possibly even Eisenhower himself. Security around Chaff headquarters in Versailles tightened overnight. Armored cars were positioned at the gates. Roads were sealed. Eisenhower's motorcade routes were changed daily. His aides were instructed not to share his schedule with anyone outside his inner circle. Even his immediate staff were temporarily restricted to quarters. The panic rippled outward. Senior officers across the front, Bradley, Patton, Hodges, were in increased personal protection details. The war effort briefly slowed under the weight of its own caution. For a few days, the Allied command structure, normally fluid and responsive, operated under siege conditions. Eisenhower himself reacted with calm professionalism. His wartime diary and later accounts by his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, describe him as composed but wary. He ordered clear protocols, all headquarters personnel to carry triple-checked identification, all visitors vetted, and all suspicious individuals detained. The irony was striking. While the front lines were locked in brutal fighting, the Allied High Command was immobilized by the idea of infiltration. That was Skorzeny's genius. The psychological reach of deception far exceeded its tactical reality. Even without a single bullet fired near Eisenhower, the Führer's commando had achieved one of Hitler's goals: to force the Allies into doubt, hesitation, and delay. The German command angle. Skorzeny's shadow wore Otto. Skorzeny understood warfare differently than most of his peers. He was not a strategist in the traditional sense. He was a saboteur, a master of psychological disruption. To him, a battle could be won as much in the mind as on the map. Born in Vienna, an engineer by training, Skorzeny rose to prominence after leading the daring 1943 rescue of Benito Mussolini from a mountain prison in Italy, a feat that impressed Hitler so deeply that he personally decorated him. After that, Skorzeny's name became synonymous with audacious special operations. Operation Greif, however, was different. It was not about physical rescue or combat. It was about illusion, about bending the perception of reality. When Hitler proposed the idea of men disguised as Americans, many Wehrmacht generals dismissed it as fantasy. The logistics were impossible, they argued, the risk of capture too high. But Skorzeny saw something else, an opportunity to weaponize Allied trust. His recruits, the so-called Panzer Brigade 150, became his experimental force. They trained in American tactics, studied enemy hand signals, and memorized slang. Skorzeny's reports to the OKW, German High Command, reveal his confidence that even a few successful infiltrations could paralyze an army far larger than his own. To some German officers, his methods bordered on dishonor. Fighting in enemy uniform violated conventions of war, but to Skorzeny and to Hitler, the moral line had long since blurred. By late 1944, Germany was fighting for survival, and survival justified deception. He later claimed that his orders were to cause maximum confusion, not to assassinate, not to sabotage directly, but to unbalance the Allied mind. In that sense, Operation Greif was less a commando raid and more a psychological experiment conducted in the middle of Europe's coldest battlefield, and it worked, at least for an time. The fear of infiltration became so pervasive that every knock on a door, every unfamiliar face at a checkpoint carried suspicion. But behind the paranoia lay deeper questions about identity, morality, and the fragile thread of trust that holds armies together. Those questions would define the next phase of the story: the psychological, moral, and tactical dimensions of the infiltration itself, how deception, fear, and war ethics collided in the frozen forests of Belgium. The psychological angle. When trust becomes a weapon by December 20th, 1944, the infiltration had achieved something no artillery barrage could: the breakdown of trust. Across Belgium and Luxembourg, Allied units turned inward. The front was no longer defined by trenches or coordinates, but by suspicion. At every roadblock, men looked at one another differently. A slight accent, an unfamiliar slang word, a hesitation in answering who won the World Series. Each became grounds for detention. Dozens of legitimate American soldiers were arrested by their own comrades, handcuffed and blindfolded until their identities could be verified. The paranoia was contagious. Entire companies demanded new password systems. MPs grew jumpy, sometimes opening fire before identifying a target. One misinterpreted movement could end in death. Psychologists later studied these moments as a textbook case of combat paranoia, the rapid erosion of interpersonal trust under uncertainty. What made it devastating was its timing. The Ardennes was already a battlefield of confusion. Snowstorms cut visibility, radios malfunctioned, and night fell early. The infiltrators simply amplified what the weather and terrain had already begun. A total collapse of confidence in one's surroundings. War had always been about recognizing the enemy. Now even that certainty was gone. For many soldiers, it was the first time they realized that a uniform could lie. The moral angle. The ethics of deception in the history of warfare. Deception has always walked a fine line between brilliance and betrayal. Operation Greif pushed that boundary to its limit. International law, specifically the Hague Convention of 1907, forbade combatants from fighting while wearing the enemy's uniform. It was considered perfidy, an abuse of the symbols that protect soldiers and prisoners alike. The logic was clear. If any uniform could be falsified, the entire system of recognition and surrender would collapse. Skorzeny's commandos operated in this moral gray zone. Many of them wore mixed clothing, partial American uniforms combined with German insignia, claiming they used the disguises only to infiltrate, not to fire. Others argued that they were acting soldiers, obeying direct orders in a desperate war. The Americans saw it differently. For them, wearing the stars and stripes while serving Hitler was unforgivable. Captured infiltrators were tried by military tribunals as spies, and most were executed by firing squad within days. Yet, even as the executions were carried out, the moral dilemma persisted. Allied intelligence officers privately acknowledged that similar deception tactics had been used by the Allies in smaller operations, false markings, feigned units and camouflage, though never on this scale. The war blurred lines of honor on both sides. Operation Greif became a mirror reflecting the desperation of late 1944. Germany's willingness to sacrifice ethics for survival, and the Allies' determination to preserve order through harsh justice. The tactical angle. The ripple effect of deception tactically. Operation Greif did not change the outcome of the Ardennes offensive, but its short-term disruptions were real and measurable. Convoys were rerouted down the wrong roads. Ammunition and fuel columns arrived late or in the wrong sectors. A few key bridges were destroyed or delayed in demolition because of false reports. At least one division, temporarily misdirected, lost an entire day of movement. In a battle where every hour mattered, those delays had consequences. American generals were forced to divert manpower away from the front to secure rear areas. Road checkpoints required hundreds of MPs. Communications staff spent days verifying orders, slowing coordination between corps and divisions. Skorzeny's men also achieved several small victories of confusion. At Malmedy, false road signs sent elements of the First Army in the wrong direction. In the Eupen area, a handful of saboteurs cut telephone lines, forcing commanders to rely on runners and couriers. Each disruption was minor, but in aggregate they added to the chaos that defined the early days of the Bulge. Still, the operation's tactical value could not outweigh its cost. Once the Americans adapted, implementing stricter identity checks, cultural quizzes, and double authentication codes, the infiltrators' freedom of movement vanished. Within days, most were captured or killed, yet their legacy endured. Even weeks later, American soldiers continued to challenge one another at random, unsure if the man before them was genuine. That residual fear, not the brief tactical success, was Operation Greif's true achievement. Operation Greif had become a case study in how information, rumor, and psychology could reshape warfare. Its infiltrators never held a town or captured a bridge of note, yet they managed to fracture morale across an entire theater. The next stage would reveal how the illusion unraveled, when military police learned to turn the deception against itself, and the baseball question became the unexpected weapon that exposed the enemy within. By December 21, 1944, the illusion had reached its breaking point. The German offensive, once a wall of steel and snow, had begun to slow under resistance and exhaustion. Yet deep behind American lines, suspicion still ruled every mile of road and every sentry post. The infiltrators of Operation Greif were out there, somewhere, and no one knew who to trust. The U.S. military police became the front line of a new kind of battle, not against tanks or artillery, but against deception itself. Their weapon was observation. Their battlefield was conversation. The web of false checkpoints, the first confirmed encounters were chaotic. Near Awil, a jeep bearing the markings of the 9th Armored Division rolled through a checkpoint, manned by what appeared to be American MPs. They waved convoys down, inspected papers, and directed trucks toward Liège. Hours later, command discovered that several fuel and ammunition convoys had vanished, misdirected south into German-held territory. Other reports emerged from Stavelot and Stoumont, where Allied soldiers stumbled on signposts turned backward, town names misspelled, or arrows pointing into enemy-held valleys. In the darkness and fog, such mischief could alter the fate of entire units. The Americans realized they were being played from within. An urgent bulletin from the 1st U.S. Army ordered, "Extreme caution. Enemy in U.S. uniforms operating behind our lines. Challenge all personnel. Use passwords. Verify papers and identification rigorously." Suddenly, every soldier became a potential counterintelligence agent. Checkpoints multiplied. MPs in white helmets patrolled crossroads, pistols drawn, as convoys halted in the snow for inspection. The MP counteroffensive at first. Identification relied on documents, paybooks, passes, unit orders, but these were easy to forge. The infiltrators' papers were near perfect, some copied from genuine captured officers. Physical details offered few clues. The German commandos had even adopted American cigarettes, chocolate, and gum to complete their disguise, so the MPs adapted. They turned to what the Germans couldn't fake: culture. They began asking spontaneous questions that no foreigner could easily answer without instinctive memory. Who won the World Series this year? What's the capital of Kentucky? How many home runs did Joe DiMaggio hit? Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? The questions spread by word of mouth through units from Liège to Bastogne. No manual dictated them. No officer wrote them down. They were a field-born response to an invisible threat. Soon, stories emerged of men hesitating too long or giving half-correct answers. One supposed lieutenant reportedly claimed that Boston Red Sox won the series, a fatal error. Since the St. Louis Cardinals had beaten the Browns in 1944, he was taken into custody immediately. Paranoia turns deadly, but the strategy had unintended consequences. The tests worked, sometimes too well. Soldiers under strain gave the wrong answer, or stumbled over slang and found themselves staring down the barrels of their comrades' rifles. General Omar Bradley, one of Eisenhower's top commanders, was detained at a checkpoint when an MP doubted his identity. A similar fate befell General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army, who was briefly delayed because he could not recall the capital of Illinois under pressure. Even journalists and Red Cross personnel were stopped, questioned, and searched. The rear areas of the American front had transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion and interrogation. Yet amid the confusion, the new system began to work. Real infiltrators, unable to navigate the web of spontaneous questions and slang, began slipping up. One hesitated when asked to spell baseball. Another mispronounced Yankees. Still another claimed his hometown was in New York State, near Chicago. Each slip narrowed the noose. The capture of the infiltrators, by December 22nd, American counterintelligence and MPs had rounded up dozens of suspects. Many were legitimate soldiers released after verification, but among them were genuine infiltrators, Germans from Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150. Interrogations at Liège and Namur revealed their orders: sabotage bridges, redirect convoys, sow confusion. Some carried demolition charges or Allied maps annotated in German. A few had radios for reporting false movements. Under questioning, the captured Germans confessed their unit designation and named their commander, Otto Skorzeny. That name alone triggered alarm at the highest levels of chef, the man who had rescued Mussolini, the master of disguise. The Americans doubled security once again, but now they had confirmation. The infiltration was real, and it was collapsing. Skorzeny watches the chaos, meanwhile, from his command post near Eiffel. Skorzeny monitored reports from the front. Only a fraction of his men had made it through. The rest were lost in traffic jams, shot, or captured. Yet his radio intercepts told him something remarkable. The Americans were paralyzed by fear. Roadblocks everywhere, commanders immobilized, Eisenhower confined under guard. From a purely psychological standpoint, Operation Greif was succeeding beyond expectation, even as it failed militarily. Skorzeny later wrote that a few dozen men had tied down thousands. He knew it couldn't last. Supplies were running out. The weather was clearing and the Allied counterattack was gathering strength. But for that frozen week before Christmas 1944, his idea had bent an empire of logistics into confusion. In the forests of Belgium, snow continued to fall. Convoys crawled forward again, slower but surer now. The Americans had learned their lesson. Trust, once shattered, could only be rebuilt through vigilance. But the story wasn't over. Some of Skorzeny's men were still at large. A few remained deep behind lines, trapped, hunted, their disguises wearing thin. The next phase would see the final unraveling, the last captures, the executions, and Skorzeny's own reckoning with the laws of war. By Christmas Eve 1944, the U.S. Army had turned the tide in the Ardennes. The German advance had slowed to a crawl under relentless Allied counterattacks, and the deception of Operation Greif, once the spearhead of confusion, was now reduced to isolated fugitives. But the psychological chaos the infiltrators unleashed still pulsed through every checkpoint, every intersection, every soldier's heartbeat in that frozen, distrustful landscape. The final manhunt with the infiltration confirmed. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, CHEF, initiated one of the largest manhunts in European history. Orders went out from Eisenhower's office itself. All personnel will be questioned. All vehicles will be checked. Any man found in enemy uniform or in possession of forged papers is to be detained immediately. Thousands of soldiers were stopped, frisked, interrogated, and lined up against snowy roadsides while MPs examined their boots, rifles, and dog tags under lantern light. Some checkpoints demanded soldiers recite states and their capitals in rapid succession. Others tested them on baseball statistics, movie stars, or the Pledge of Allegiance. One MP, stationed outside UPenn, recalled, "We asked one guy who played center field for the Yankees. He said Joe DiMaggio. We let him through. The next guy said it was Babe Ruth. He hadn't played in years. We knew we had one." Every roadblock felt like a stage set for betrayal. Some soldiers joked nervously about being arrested for not knowing baseball. Others carried clippings from newspapers to prove their Americanness. But behind the jokes was real fear. Fear that one wrong answer could mean death. Infiltrators on the run for the German infiltrators still behind the lines. Survival was growing impossible. The disguise that had once granted them freedom now made them targets for both sides. If captured by the Americans, they faced trial and execution as spies. If they tried to slip back to their own lines, they risked being shot by German troops, who no longer recognized their American uniforms in the chaos. A small group attempted to escape near Malmedy, using the confusion of night convoys to blend in. They were caught after an MP noticed one man's boots, genuine German issue, with hobnails that clicked distinctly on the frozen asphalt. Another was discovered when his Jeep broke down near Spa. As he tried to repair it, a passing U.S. officer noticed the serial number plate on the vehicle had been filed off, a sign of sabotage. Interrogations revealed just how deeply Operation Greif had been planned. The infiltrators had studied American slang, memorized radio call signs, and even been trained to curse like GIs. Some had spent weeks practicing driving on the right-hand side of the road, a habit opposite to the German standard. But even the best trained deception has limits. Hunger, exhaustion, and constant fear began to unravel their precision. 1. Captured infiltrator Gefreiter Günther Billing confessed under questioning, "It was not the guns that caught us. It was the questions. Always the questions." The field executions captured German infiltrators faced a grim fate. Under the Geneva Convention, soldiers caught wearing enemy uniforms while conducting sabotage could be treated as spies and executed. By December 23rd, after military tribunals convened near Namur, Eupen, and Stavelot, the U.S. Army sentenced several of Skorzeny's men to death. The executions were carried out swiftly by firing squad in the snow. One of the most documented cases occurred near Huy, Belgium, where 3 men, captured wearing American uniforms and carrying forged papers, were tried and executed within 24 hours. Their graves were marked only with wooden stakes. The proceedings were quiet, efficient, and deeply unsettling. For many Allied soldiers, Watching men die in U.S. uniforms felt like witnessing the war's moral boundaries blur. The rules of warfare, already stretched thin by the cold and blood of the Ardennes, were being rewritten under pressure. Still, the executions had a purpose: deterrence. Word spread quickly that the Americans were taking no chances. By Christmas morning, most remaining infiltrators had either surrendered or been killed in skirmishes. The deception was over, but its echo remained. Eisenhower under guard in Paris, the panic reached even higher. For several days in December, General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself was placed under armed guard at his headquarters. Rumors spread that Skorzeny's commandos had orders to capture or assassinate him. An extension of the infiltration meant to decapitate the Allied command. Though no evidence ever proved that such a mission existed, the fear was real. Armed escorts shadowed Eisenhower around the clock. His motorcade routes were changed daily, and orders were issued forbidding any unauthorized personnel from approaching Allied headquarters. Journalists were told not to report his movements. Even Eisenhower later admitted that for a brief time, the idea of German commandos dressed as U.S. generals seemed disturbingly plausible. The operation that had failed to capture a single bridge or destroy a single depot had still managed to lock down the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Skorzeny's mission ends by early January 1945. Otto Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150 was withdrawn from the front. Of the 150 men sent behind American lines, only a few returned. The majority were dead, missing, or captured. Skorzeny himself, narrowly, escaped encirclement, retreating east through the Eifel under heavy artillery fire. Yet despite the operational failure, he considered Operation Greif a partial success. His small force had forced the Allies into days of paralysis, suspicion, and internal lockdown, tying down tens of thousands of men and vehicles. In his post-war memoir, Skorzeny wrote, "We failed to reach the Meuse, but we succeeded in shaking the enemy's nerves. For the Americans, that was true enough. By the time the Ardennes front stabilized in January, thousands of man-hours had been diverted to identity checks and internal security. The infiltration threat had vanished, but the psychological damage lingered. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on for weeks more, but Operation Greif had already passed into legend. A story whispered through the ranks, half real, half myth. Yet the truth, recorded in field reports and interrogation transcripts, was stranger and more human than any myth. A handful of soldiers fluent in a foreign language nearly made the mightiest army on earth doubt itself. In the snow-covered fields of Belgium, their footprints were already vanishing beneath the frost, leaving only suspicion behind. But as January dawned and the Allies reclaimed their rhythm, questions remained. How many infiltrators were truly caught? How many had slipped through? And what would become of the man who masterminded it all, Otto Skorzeny, once the war was over? January 1945. The snow along the Ardennes was no longer white. It had turned gray, streaked with mud, oil, and the blackened debris of burnt-out convoys. The German counteroffensive had failed. The Bulge mob, once a deep spearhead into Allied territory, was collapsing under relentless airstrikes and artillery fire. Yet amid the retreating columns and shattered towns, Operation Greif lingered like a ghost. Its physical remnants were few: a handful of captured jeeps, counterfeit papers, and corpses in American uniforms. But its psychological impact stretched far beyond the battlefield. The toll of paranoia. Even after the German infiltrators were largely neutralized, suspicion persisted across the front. Military police continued to question travelers weeks after the offensive had ended. In some cases, the paranoia outlasted the danger itself. One U.S. Army report dated January 15, 1945 noted, "There remains widespread fear of disguised enemy agents among forward troops. Multiple false arrests continue, including officers of high rank." The infiltration panic had disrupted military cohesion in ways that no artillery barrage could. Commanders delayed orders until identities were confirmed. Couriers were stopped repeatedly along their routes. In some sectors, the flow of supplies slowed to a crawl because drivers refused to trust directions unless they came personally from a known officer. Even among civilians, rumors flourished. Belgian townspeople whispered that Germans were still hiding in American uniforms, stealing fuel, or assassinating officers. The thin line between vigilance and hysteria had been crossed. For days after Christmas, loyalty questions dominated Army life. Soldiers quizzed each other on baseball, radio shows, and American slang. Newspapers ran headlines mocking the paranoia. Who won the World Series? Check with the MPs first. But the humor masked a deeper unease. The fate of the captured by early January, the Allies had captured roughly 44 men linked to Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150, while wearing U.S. uniforms. The legal question of what to do with them divided Allied command. Some officers argued they should be treated as conventional prisoners of war since they had originally been uniformed soldiers acting under orders. Others insisted they were spies under Article 23 of the Hague Regulations, which prohibited fighting in enemy uniforms. Field tribunals leaned toward the latter interpretation. At least 13 captured infiltrators were executed by firing squad in Belgium between December 23rd and January 3rd. Others were held for further interrogation, their testimonies compiled into intelligence summaries later archived by Chef. In one declassified report, an American intelligence officer wrote, "The enemy agents showed remarkable discipline and training. Their English was nearly flawless. Their downfall lay not in appearance, but in cultural ignorance, a small but decisive weakness." Skorzeny's return to Germany. Otto Skorzeny returned to Germany in January 1945 to a hero's welcome among Nazi elites. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels hailed him as the man who strikes fear into the enemy's heart. Newspapers celebrated Operation Greif as proof of German ingenuity, omitting the fact that the operation had failed to achieve any of its strategic goals. Skorzeny himself was realistic. In private correspondence, he admitted that his men had paid too high a price for too little result. The German army's logistical nightmare, fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and collapsing morale had doomed any hope of success. Yet within Hitler's shrinking circle, the mere idea of infiltration and psychological warfare appealed to desperation. Plans were even drawn up for similar missions in the East, though none were ever executed on the same scale. The legal reckoning. After the war ended in May 1945, Skorzeny was captured by the U.S. Army near Salzburg, Austria. He was taken to the Dachau trials, where he faced prosecution for war crimes, primarily his role in Operation Greif and the use of enemy uniforms. The prosecution argued that by disguising his men as American soldiers, Skorzeny had violated international law. The defense countered that his troops had only worn U.S. uniforms for deception and reconnaissance, not for combat. In July 1947, the tribunal rendered its verdict, not guilty. The court accepted evidence that Allied forces had, on occasion, used similar tactics during the war, including the wearing of enemy uniforms for infiltration or deception. A British officer even testified on Skorzeny's behalf, stating, "We would have done the same thing under similar circumstances." It was one of the most controversial acquittals of the post-war trials. Afterward, Skorzeny spent time in U.S. custody before escaping in 1948, allegedly aided by former SS contacts and sympathetic American intelligence officers during the early Cold War, a legacy of shadows. The story of Operation Greif slowly faded into the background of the massive Battle of the Bulge narrative. To the soldiers who had lived through it, however, the memory of those tense days never vanished. It remained a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in modern mechanized war, the mind was still the most vulnerable battlefield, and the baseball question, that strange, almost absurd method of detection, became part of military folklore. It symbolized how ordinary knowledge, something as trivial as a sports score, had become a weapon of survival in a war of deception. In the following years, counterintelligence schools across the U.S. military used Operation Greif as a case study in psychological warfare, proof that misinformation and disguise could destabilize armies as surely as artillery. But the war wasn't done, reshaping the lives of those who had fought in its shadows. For the survivors of Skorzeny's brigade, the end of the war brought no closure, only questions of guilt, loyalty, and the blurred morality of orders followed under a doomed regime. And for the Americans who had interrogated, judged, and sometimes executed those infiltrators, The moral weight of those decisions lingered long after the snow melted in Belgium. Spring 1945. The snow that had once blanketed the Ardennes melted into muddy rivers running through ruined villages. The trees that had hidden tanks now stood black and splintered, their branches stripped by artillery fire. And beneath that thawing landscape lay the remnants of the most chaotic winter the Western Front had ever seen. A battlefield of confusion, fear and cunning. The infiltration panic that began with Operation Greif had reshaped how the U.S. Army viewed security, intelligence, and trust itself. The Army rebuilds its nerves as the front stabilized and Allied forces crossed into Germany. The psychological scars of the infiltration began to show. The fear that any man in an American uniform could be an enemy agent had fractured confidence within the ranks. To restore morale, commanders issued new directives emphasizing unity and verification. Special training sessions were organized to teach soldiers how to authenticate documents, identify uniforms, and conduct interrogation without panic or prejudice. The military police corps, once seen as mere traffic regulators, emerged from the Bulge as a respected arm of the Army's counterintelligence network. In February 1945, Chef Intelligence formally commended the MPs' quick adaptation under pressure, noting, "Their initiative in identifying disguised enemy personnel prevented widespread sabotage and preserved operational integrity during a period of maximum confusion." In effect, the MPs had proven that psychology and vigilance could win battles just as decisively as tanks or bombers. The legacy of fear. Even after the last infiltrator was captured or killed, Operation Greif left behind a lingering paranoia that bled into the early Cold War years. When the U.S. Army began reorganizing its European commands after Germany's surrender, many officers cited the infiltration scare as proof that enemy deception was a permanent threat. By 1946, American intelligence manuals explicitly referenced Skorzeny's operation as a model for future Soviet tactics. Training exercises introduced new verification procedures inspired by the baseball test, spontaneous cultural questioning designed to expose impostors. In later decades, the story would evolve into legend, how a handful of German infiltrators had turned the world's most powerful army against its own shadow. Some accounts exaggerated their success, claiming hundreds of agents had roamed behind Allied lines, though official post-war investigations put the number closer to 44 genuine infiltrators. Still, the truth was extraordinary enough. Never before in modern warfare had language, slang, and small talk become tools of counter-espionage. Public reaction and wartime propaganda. When news of the infiltration broke to the public in late December 1944, newspapers across the United States erupted with sensational headlines. Nazi spies in U.S. uniforms. Germans disguised as Yanks. Enemy saboteurs behind our lines. Though military censors initially tried to suppress the reports, the story spread too fast. For a home front already shaken by the Battle of the Bulge's surprise attack, the idea that Germans could impersonate American soldiers struck a deep chord of anxiety. Hollywood newsreels dramatized the manhunt with ominous narration and grainy footage of MPs checking papers in the snow. Families of soldiers wrote letters to the War Department demanding assurance that our boys were being protected from these impostors. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence exploited the hysteria for strategic gain. Leaflets and broadcasts into German lines warned Wehrmacht troops that their own commandos were being executed by the Americans, hoping to sow distrust between German units. Ironically, Skorzeny's deception had been turned back against the Reich, weaponized through rumor and propaganda. Moral and legal questions. After the war, the moral complexity of Operation Greif continued to trouble military ethicists and legal scholars. Was it lawful deception or criminal espionage? Where was the line between psychological warfare and treachery? The Dachau trials of 1947 established no definitive boundary. While Skorzeny was acquitted, the judgment set a precedent that deception was permissible only if enemy uniforms were discarded before combat began. The verdict became a cornerstone in post-war interpretations of international warfare law. But for many Allied veterans who had seen men die in familiar uniforms, legality was beside the point. They spoke instead of betrayal, of how the infiltration had violated an unspoken trust between soldiers on opposite sides. Years later, One U.S. MP who had served in Belgium reflected, "They fooled us once, but it changed everything. After that, we stopped assuming that a uniform meant anything at all." That sentiment would echo through later wars, from Korea to Vietnam, where disguise, infiltration, and asymmetric tactics became the new face of conflict. Skorzeny's post-war shadow Otto Skorzeny never vanished from history. After escaping from Allied custody in 1948, he resurfaced in Spain under the protection of Francisco Franco's regime. From there, he became a consultant for military and intelligence services across Europe and the Middle East, even rumored to have advised Egypt and Argentina on commando tactics. The legend of his wartime exploits, rescuing Mussolini, leading daring raids, and masterminding Operation Greif, turned him into both villain and icon, depending on who told the story. In the 1950s and 1960s, Western intelligence agencies quietly studied his methods. Cold War training manuals in both NATO and Warsaw Pact countries referenced Operation Greif as a benchmark in psychological operations. Skorzeny himself remained unrepentant until his death in 1975. In his memoirs, he wrote, "War is deception. Those who are unwilling to deceive will be deceived." It was both a defense and a confession, the philosophy of a man who had weaponized trust itself. A world that learned to question for the U.S. Army. The infiltration crisis of 1944 became more than a wartime incident. It was a lasting doctrine. Future wars would be fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with misinformation, disguise, and psychological manipulation. And in that sense, Operation Greif was prophetic. It predicted the espionage wars of the 20th century, where uniforms meant nothing, and identity was the first casualty. The lesson was written not in strategy manuals or after-action reports, but in the frozen memories of those who had stood guard in the Ardennes, questioning strangers in the snow, searching for the smallest slip that could mean life or death. They had learned that the most dangerous weapon an enemy could wield wasn't a tank or a rifle. It was a familiar face. The snow had long melted by the time the men of the First Army marched into Germany. But in their memories, those long nights under flickering lanterns asking absurd questions about baseball and movie stars would never fade. It had been absurd, yes, but it had saved lives. And it had shown the world that in war, truth itself could be a battlefield. The Ardennes quieted long ago. The wind still moves through those forests, soft, cold, and indifferent, brushing across the ground where men once stood in fear of one another's faces. There are no signposts now, no roadblocks, no shouted questions about baseball or home states. Only silence, broken by the distant echo of what Operation Greif truly was, not merely a mission of disguise, but a test of trust itself. The fragility of truth. In the winter of 1944, a handful of German soldiers forced the world's most powerful army to question the simplest human assumption, that what you see is what you can believe. Their weapons were not rifles or grenades. They were mimicry, language, and the fragile psychology of recognition. Every time a U.S. soldier stopped a jeep and asked, "Who won the World Series?" it wasn't just a question of sports trivia. It was an act of survival. The battlefield had shifted inward, from the snowy roads of Belgium to the uncertain space inside a man's mind, where doubt and instinct collided. And in that space, Operation Greif revealed a truth older than any, or the strongest armies are not undone by firepower but by fear. The fear of being deceived. The fear that the man beside you is not who he claims to be. The human cost of deception. Otto Skorzeny's infiltration achieved little on the map. No bridges taken, no supply lines destroyed. Yet its invisible effects lingered long after the shooting stopped. In those tense days, soldiers turned on suspicion more often than on the enemy. Generals were detained. Orders were delayed. Trust, that silent, invisible bond that makes armies function, fractured across the front. It was a reminder that warfare is not only a clash of steel and strategy, but of perception. Once deception enters the bloodstream of an army, every uniform, every password, every handshake becomes uncertain. That uncertainty, not the bullets, is what truly kills confidence. For the Americans in the Ardennes, regaining that confidence required more than victory. It required faith in each other again. Lessons written in snow today. Historians call Operation Greif a failure. Militarily, it accomplished nothing of lasting value. But psychologically, it changed everything. The U.S. Army rewrote its doctrines on counterintelligence and internal security. Military police training evolved from traffic management into behavioral analysis and interrogation science. Soldiers were taught not just to identify enemies by sight, but to read hesitation, tone, and instinct. The baseball question, born in panic on a snowy road in 1944, became an enduring metaphor in military intelligence circles. When logic fails, culture reveals. What Skorzeny had not anticipated was that the same human familiarity he tried to exploit would become the key to his defeat. Echoes into the Cold War. In the years that followed, the shadow of Operation Greif stretched across the coming age of espionage and misinformation. The world that emerged from World War II was no longer one of clear lines and visible enemies. It was a world of disguises, of double agents, counter-spies, and silent wars fought in embassies and alleys rather than trenches. The paranoia that once gripped the Ardennes became the foundation of Cold War intelligence. Verify, question, suspect. What had begun as Skorzeny's tactical experiment in deception became a permanent fixture in the psychology of modern conflict. The paradox of the infiltrator. There is a haunting irony in Operation Greif. Skorzeny's men had tried to become American, to mimic the confidence, the language, the ease. Yet in doing so, they revealed something profoundly human. That identity cannot be copied perfectly. Culture, memory, humor, hesitation, these things belong to the lived experience of a people. And in the end, it was that humanity, not superior firepower, that unmasked them. Their defeat was not merely military but philosophical. Deception could imitate appearance but not essence. A final quiet image. Imagine again that cold December night. A jeep idles in the snow. A flashlight cuts through the darkness. An MP leans forward, voice steady but weary, asking a question that seems absurd in the middle of war. Who won the World Series this year? For a heartbeat, the entire front waits on that answer. And in that pause, in that fragile exchange between doubt and trust, lies the essence of modern warfare. That even amid the thunder of artillery and the machinery of nations, victory still depends on something profoundly human, the ability to recognize truth when you see it. The infiltrators are gone, the snow has melted, but the lesson remains, whispering through history like the wind across the Ardennes. War tests weapons. Deception tests souls. The Ardennes quieted long ago. The wind still moves through those forests, soft, cold, and indifferent, brushing across the ground where men once stood in fear of one another's faces. There are no signposts now, no roadblocks, no shouted questions about baseball or home states. Only silence, broken by the distant echo of what Operation Greif truly was. Not merely a mission of disguise, but a test of trust itself. The fragility of truth. In the winter of 1944, a handful of German soldiers forced the world's most powerful army to question the simplest human assumption, that what you see is what you can believe. Their weapons were not rifles or grenades. They were mimicry, language, and the fragile psychology of recognition. Every time a U.S. soldier stopped a jeep and asked, "Who won the World Series?" And it wasn't just a question of sports trivia. It was an act of survival. The battlefield had shifted inward, from the snowy roads of Belgium to the uncertain space inside a man's mind, where doubt and instinct collided. And in that space, Operation Greif revealed a truth older than any war. The strongest armies are not undone by firepower, but by fear. The fear of being deceived. The fear that the man beside you is not who he claims to be. The human cost of deception. Otto Skorzeny's infiltration achieved little on the map. No bridges taken, no supply lines destroyed. Yet its invisible effects lingered long after the shooting stopped. In those tense days, soldiers turned on suspicion more often than on the enemy. Generals were detained. Orders were delayed. Trust, that silent, invisible bond that makes armies function, fractured across the front. It was a reminder that warfare is not only a clash of steel and strategy, but of perception. Once deception enters the bloodstream of an army, every uniform, every password, every handshake becomes uncertain. That uncertainty, not the bullets, is what truly kills confidence. For the Americans in the Ardennes, regaining that confidence required more than victory. It required faith in each other again. Lessons written in snow today. Historians call Operation Greif a failure. Militarily, it accomplished nothing of lasting value, but psychologically, it changed everything. The U.S. Army rewrote its doctrines on counterintelligence and internal security. Military police training evolved from traffic management into behavioral analysis and interrogation science. Soldiers were taught not just to identify enemies by sight, but to read hesitation, tone, and instinct. The baseball question, born in panic on a snowy road in 1944, became an enduring metaphor in military intelligence circles. When logic fails, culture reveals. What Skorzeny had not anticipated was that the same human familiarity he tried to exploit would become the key to his defeat. Echoes into the Cold War. In the years that followed, the shadow of Operation Greif stretched across the coming age of espionage and misinformation. The world that emerged from World War II was no longer one of clear lines and visible enemies. It was a world of disguises, of double agents, counter spies, and silent wars fought in embassies and alleys rather than trenches. The paranoia that once gripped the Ardennes became the foundation of Cold War intelligence. Verify, question, suspect. What had begun as Skorzeny's tactical experiment in deception became a permanent fixture in the psychology of modern conflict. The paradox of the infiltrator. There is a haunting irony in Operation Greif. Skorzeny's men had tried to become American, to mimic the confidence, the language, the ease. Yet in doing so, they revealed something profoundly human, that identity cannot be copied perfectly. Culture, memory, humor, hesitation, these things belong to the lived experience of a people. And in the end, it was that humanity, not superior firepower, that unmasked them. Their defeat was not merely military, but philosophical. Deception could imitate appearance, but not essence. A final quiet image. Imagine again that cold December night. A jeep idles in the snow. A flashlight cuts through the darkness. An MP leans forward, voice steady but weary, asking a question that seems absurd in the middle of war. Who won the World Series this year? For a heartbeat, the entire front waits on that answer, and in that pause, in that fragile exchange between doubt and trust, lies the essence of modern warfare. That even amid the thunder of artillery and the machinery of nations, victory still depends on something profoundly human, the ability to recognize truth when you see it. The infiltrators are gone. The snow has melted, but the lesson remains, whispering through history like the wind across the Ardennes. War tests weapons. Deception tests souls.